Hi, I'm Paul Cull from Community Response Consultants, and in this short video I want to outline a proposed disaster response team training course that I have been working on. This course is intended for vulnerable communities and developing nations and is based around the content of the Community Emergency Response Team CERT course by FEMA, the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency. Now, before we go on, I would like to first just give a quick overview of the current CERT training course. The CERT at the moment has a basic course of around 20 to 24 hours that is based around 8 classroom units and a final practical simulated exercise. Now, the classroom units make use of PowerPoint. There are over 400 slides in the standard CERT course, and the participant manual and of course the instructor's guide. Now, whereas this is a great model for teaching in the developed world, what we have been finding in the developing nations has been that groups with limited levels of literacy have found it more difficult to accompany this form of training. So let's just have a quick look at the 8 units on the classroom part of the CERT course and the final exercise before we go on to discuss how we could present this course in a different format. Now, Unit 1, Disaster Preparedness, begins with a team building exercise and then goes on to look at the CERT program in the United States. It then includes specific disaster scenarios, which are hazard annexes. They are slideshows that the instructors will choose somewhere between 1 to 3 specific hazards for that particular community. It discusses disasters in general, their impact, and goes on to discuss mitigation and preparedness activities, both from the emergency management authorities, also at the community, family and individual level. So it discusses evacuation, and there's a tabletop exercise and what people would take with them if they're called to evacuate. It looks at individual and family plans for disasters and what should be included in a disaster survival kit. Finally, it presents the PPE, the personal protective equipment that should be used by CERT team members, and this equipment is distributed either for use only through the course, or depending on the jurisdiction, it may be that course participants get to keep that equipment so that they can then use it as they're part of a CERT team. Now, CERT began in Los Angeles, and the major scenario that was envisaged at the time was an earthquake. So it then looks at possible post-impact hazards in an earthquake scenario and other situations which result in widespread destruction. So it looks at hazardous materials, utility controls such as electricity and gas supplies, and then it goes on to discuss fire prevention, fire chemistry, and firefighting procedures. This is where the safety protocols are first presented, so that includes the 9-step size-up protocol, the buddy system, and participants are taught how to use fire extinguishers to extinguish small fires. This then has a practical activity where the course participants will use the fire extinguishers to put out either a real or a simulated fire. CERT Unit 3 is Disaster Medical Operations 1, and it presents 3 life-threatening conditions known as 3 killers, which are airway obstruction, excessive bleeding, and shock. Participants are taught simple techniques they can practice to open airways, to control bleeding, and to treat shock, and they then practice these activities along with removing gloves. They then taught triage using the START, simple triage and rapid treatment protocol, and they practice this either in the standard FEMA model, the class is divided in thirds and they practice on each other, or in the Teen CERT model, it may be practiced using toy stuffed animals or cutout figures. Disaster Medical Operations 2 is Unit 4 of the CERT course, and it begins looking at the medical treatment area where the victims are kept until they can be transported or treated by the professional responders. This may be for a period of hours or even days in a major disaster. So in addition to the localization operation of the medical treatment area, course participants are taught about public health considerations, hygiene and sanitation, and the head-to-toe secondary assessment of victims. This module then goes on to discuss disaster-specific first aid scenarios such as fractures, burns, heat and cold-related injuries, and animal stings and bites, and they practice splinting using improvised materials such as cardboard boxes. Unit 5 is Light Search and Rescue. It describes the 9-step size-up protocol in detail, and it looks at how teams can assess the level of structural damage as to whether they should enter into a particular building or not to undertake search and rescue. It outlines interior and exterior search and rescue protocols and the FEMA specific building structural marking protocol. The participants are then taught victim extrication using levering and cribbing, and a number of different ways to transport victims, such as using chairs and blankets and other methods. Unit 6 looks at CERT team organisation. It discusses the team structure, the call-out protocol. It also looks at the American NIMS, the National Incident Management System, and ICS, the Incident Command System, and includes a tabletop exercise on ICS positions. It goes on to discuss the team documentation and forms, both those which are used by team members for damage evaluation, the forms used at the medical treatment area, and those that would be used by the incident commander team leader for documenting the team's activities. Unit 7 is disaster psychology. It's a very short unit, around 45 minutes long. It discusses common symptoms of post-traumatic stress and offers techniques that can be used by team leaders and members to reduce their own stress, both before, during, and after an operation. It goes on to discuss how team members can help disaster survivors with their own post-traumatic stress, and although it doesn't actually teach any specific psychological first aid models. It finishes with some suggested words that could be used to inform relatives of people who have passed away during the disaster. There are no practical activities in this unit. Unit 8 discusses terrorism in CERT. It describes the different weapons that may be used by terrorists and outlines the steps that are often taken out by terrorists both before and during an incident, so that CERT team members may be able to detect a terrorist attack either before it's happening or while it's underway. As a terrorist incident is a hazardous materials incident, CERT team members are not allowed to deploy or operate in that environment. They're taught just to remain outside the area of impact and to alert the authorities. There's a tabletop exercise at the end of this unit that looks at identifying and what the appropriate response would be to a terrorist incident. Following the 8 classroom units, there is a revision of the course material, a 13-page multiple choice post-test exam, and then a simulated exercise where the course participants will practice the skills they have learned in a simulated disaster. This is followed by a debrief, and often the team members are then presented with the certificates and possibly the team ID. Now, what I am proposing is a training course that is very similar to the current CERT structure and that could in fact be used to teach the same content that's found in the basic CERT course. However, instead of being based around PowerPoint and student manuals, it would be scenario based. It would be completely immersive and interactive course where from the very first unit, the course participants will be carrying out the activities necessary as if they were in the environment of a disaster. So we would have 8, if you like, classroom units, although the classroom environment will be very interactive, and it will be followed by a simulated exercise where they put everything together. Now, this course will have two scenarios, what we call the primary and secondary scenarios. The primary scenario will actually apply to the first 7 units of this course. It will be, as in the case of CERT, is often an earthquake or a tornado, a landslide or a hurricane. And it will be an event similar to this that will allow the team to respond with search and rescue, triage and medical treatment. So we're looking at an event that basically breaks things, and that will be the primary scenario for the first 7 lessons in this course. Now, the secondary scenario will be something different to that which has been used in the first 7 units of the course, and that requires a different response. So in the case of the standard CERT course, it is terrorism, which requires a different response than the standard CERT protocol of search and rescue, triage, and medical care. So examples of the secondary scenario could be flooding or a volcano, could be a terrorist attack or a hazmat incident, could be tsunamis or wildfires, heat waves or pandemics. And it will present a different response and set of skills that will be practiced by the participants in this lesson. So as we saw, the first 7 units of this course will be based around the primary scenario that could result in significant destruction and possibly offer opportunities for search and rescue, triage and medical care. Now, the secondary scenario will be presented in Unit 8, and the course participants will learn and practice a different set of skills to respond to that scenario. Now, the final simulated exercise will be built around the primary scenario, as it requires search and rescue, triage, and medical care. Although, if possible, the secondary scenario might be included as an inject in this simulated exercise. So what would our course actually look like? Well, Unit 1 will be disaster preparedness. So participants arrive, they're taught about the role of the team, some humanitarian principles, and then they are told about the primary scenario as if they were in the pre-impact phase. Maybe if it's a landslide, they're looking at the early warning systems, maybe they're making rainfall gauges. If it's an earthquake, there may have been a small scale shock already, but they're waiting for the big one. Whatever it is, we begin by teaching about alert and alarm techniques and early warning systems. We then go on to the moment of impact, which will be simulated, and they may need to know what to do at that particular moment, like drop, cover, and hold on in the case of an earthquake. Then make the immediate decisions post-impact. Do they evacuate or stay where they are? This will then lead on to a discussion and practical activities about what should be included in a survival kit, and also about the plans that are necessary on the individual, family and community level to prepare for that particular disaster scenario. Now, Unit 2 will take some of the information from Unit 1, but also a lot of the information is found in Unit 6 in the CERT course. And it will look at the team deployment post-impact. So it will simulate the team's meeting point or their base. They'll look at the impact of that particular scenario on the infrastructure. They will do damage assessment, and they will look at where the team could possibly be deployed. It will then outline the emergency management structure and discuss and practice how they would then make contact with the emergency management authorities. Now, Unit 3 is basically Unit 2 from the CERT course. It's looking at post-disaster hazards. So it will discuss hazardous materials, public utilities, how to turn off electricity and gas, and also the case of small fires and how the team can put out fires. So it will cover the same material as in Unit 2, but also include the practical activity of using fire extinguishers or alternate methods to put out small fires. Now, Unit 4 is disaster medical response. It will be similar to the CERT Unit 3, and it will include a look at the 3 killers, the airway obstruction, excessive bleeding, and shock. And it will also practice opening airways, controlling bleeding, treating shock, but it will also include more basic first aid. It will use mannequins, and we'll teach some principles that could also apply to day-to-day situations as well as disasters. It will then go on to teach triage, either the START or the SALT protocols, and they will practice triage using either the toy stuffed animals or cutout figures. It will then include the medical treatment area, which is found in CERT Disaster Medical Operations 2 unit, so that they can practice triage and removing the victims to the medical treatment area. So we're now beginning to discuss CERT team or disaster response team organization with a instant command post and the medical treatment area. Because of the increased content in this unit, it may be split into two parts, discussing basic first aid and the three killers, and then going on to triage and the medical treatment area. Now, Unit 5 is similar to Disaster Medical Ops 2 in the CERT course, although it doesn't include the medical treatment area, but it will contain more basic first aid in addition to fractures, burns, the heat and cold related injuries and bites and stings. It may go on to discuss CPR and heart attacks and strokes and choking. This will be customized to the group because in not all situations would CPR or AED be appropriate, but as possible, we'll include the first aid training that could be most appropriate for this particular group. Now, Unit 6 will look at light search and rescue. Will be very similar to the CERT Unit 5. It will also include some of the more modern protocols of hazard control, and also maybe look at some other forms of how the victims can be extricated from under debris. And depending on the team, it may also look at specific equipment such as rescue stretchers or longboards that may be used by that team. It will also include the international protocols, the INSARAG building structure marking system, and the whistle codes. Now, Unit 7 will be the disaster psychology module, and so it will include the signs and symptoms of stress and stress reduction techniques, but it will also go on to include more psychological first aid, including a simple protocol for working with victims, and there will be practical exercises and scenarios included in this unit. Now, Unit 8 is the secondary scenario, so it could be terrorism, this isn't the case in the CERT course, or it could be another situation that is more appropriate to that community. Whatever it is, it will present the scenario in an interactive, immersive environment, but then go on to practice an appropriate response. So that might be a shelter in place, for example, for a volcanic eruption, or maybe the planning of an evacuation for a tsunami, or it could include a flood rescue and response activities. Now, Unit 9 will start with a recap of the information that has been presented throughout the course and a post-test, although I would not recommend a 13-page one as FEMA use. Of course, if you're going to do a post-test, I would strongly recommend that you begin with a pre-test at the start of Unit 1 so that you have a baseline that you can compare the results to gauge the skill acquisition by the course participants. It will then go on for the simulated exercise, which will be primarily based around the primary scenario. They may include an inject with the secondary scenario. Finally, there will be a debrief, and often at this point, team members may be awarded their certificates. Now, of course, it's really important to consider localization and contextualization of the basic training course. So what we want to do is have the minimal basic information and training that's needed according to the most current international protocols. But as appropriate, even the basic training may need to be customized with the addition of further units. These could include any of the following or possibly some other units that aren't mentioned here. Possibilities may be basic or advanced first aid, disaster media skills, both social media and also working with the press, possibly CPR and AED training. Obviously, this is not usually applied in a disaster scenario, and even in the day-to-day situation in the developing world, we need to consider whether the chain of survival is available. Maybe emergency needs assessment or disaster assessment may need to be taught in a more detailed manner. It's just like a psychological first aid could be taught, maybe the critical incident stress management protocol or another PFA protocol. Although we will outline humanitarian principles and volunteerism, of course, further modules could be added regarding that, or even leadership development modules. There could also be the need to train disaster communications, maybe the use of either tactical or amateur radios. Also, a citizen response to active shooter or active attacker events. These are just some examples, because it may be that when the instructors are present in that community, we need to make the most of that time and introduce some additional training as well. Now, once teams have been trained, it's important that they remain motivated and that additional exercises and training are made available to them. This could include, for example, training on emergency management procedures. They may be able to help the local authorities with emergency operations centers or short-term shelters. You may want to create a call-out team where the members who are more available, more interested in continuing on from the different community teams, they can be trained to create a call-out team that could assist the professional responders in non-disaster situations. Teams may require training in shelter operations and management or animals and disasters. Some teams may desire to receive disaster spiritual care and chaplaincy training, or they could be trained to operate a community emergency hub. In addition, further training could be offered in search and rescue, like the INSARAG first responder course, or land search and rescue, or even swift water rescue. And finally, the creation of a community-based disaster response team could be the initiative to begin a community-based disaster risk management program where a committee is formed and other mitigation and preparedness activities are taken out in the community. Now, the basic training course would probably take between 20 to 24 hours, and not everybody is always able to spare that amount of time for basic training. So it would be possible to create 3 smaller courses, each of which offers a certificate, that when the participants have completed all of these courses, they can then become members of a disaster response team. So in this case, we could take, for example, units 1 and 2, that's disaster preparedness and team organization. We'd still teach them the same way in the immersive scenario-based teaching method. And at the end of those first 2 courses, which maybe could be done on a weekend or maybe even one day, they would then receive their first certificate. We would then create the second course with disaster medical response, disaster first aid, and disaster psychology. And once again, teach that maybe in 1 or 2 days and award them a first aid and psych first aid certificate. We'd then create a third course, which would have the post-disaster hazards, firefighting unit, the light search and rescue, and the secondary scenario, and we'd put them all together in a course that maybe could be taught over a weekend or 1 full day. And once again, another certificate would be awarded for that course. Then finally, people who've completed all 3 courses could then come for a full day perhaps, or even a weekend, where there's a revision of all the course material and then the simulated exercise when they put into practice everything they've learned, at which point they could then receive the certificates and become members of a disaster response team. So this course would enable us to take the content of the basic CERT training course, update it for latest international protocols, and localize it for the community where we would be teaching the course, but then teach it in an interactive scenario-based manner. This would ensure that we can teach it to vulnerable groups, to communities that maybe don't have a high literacy level. It would also make the task of translating a lot easier. We wouldn't need to translate over 400 PowerPoint slides and the several hundred pages of the participant manual. The only documentation we may create would be a field operations guide that they can then take with them. So I believe this would be a interesting technique that would enable us to take the life-saving techniques of the basic CERT course and present them in a different and an interactive manner for the developing world. Thanks for watching this video.